This is perhaps the review I've been most excited to bring to you guys because today we are finally taking a look at ASUS's brand new True Black Glossy OLED. That's right, the ASUS XG32UCWMG, a 4K 240Hz/480Hz at 1080p Glossy WOLED using the latest MLA or microlens array panel from LG, offering allegedly up to 1300 nits of brightness, and of course a huge improvement to the clarity via the new glossy coating, which apparently should be rejecting ambient light pretty well at the same time. So it's everything that we've been asking for, and coming in at a price of $1,099, and of course including a 3-year warranty. Well, yes, the price is quite high, but it's also very competitive with its QD-OLED alternatives. Although I do want to mention, while it does come with 2 HDMI 2.1 ports, the DisplayPort is still 1.4 and not 2.1. But other than that, everything looks incredible. Now, if you don't know me, I'm the display guy. I review everything from monitors to TVs to projectors and even VR. If that sounds interesting, make sure to get subscribed for more. But enough, let's jump into the actual data, and I'm going to start off with the bad news first, because yes, there is no perfect OLED out there, and of course this also has its issues, specifically when it comes to the accuracy. Now real quick, I do also want to mention that ASUS did provide this sample for this review. However, that doesn't mean I'm going to be holding back. No, if I see something wrong, I'll be sure to let you know. Now if you just want the TLDR, feel free to skip ahead, but for all you display enthusiasts, let's jump into the Portrait Display CalMAN Ultimate results, which, as a disclaimer, I am part of their reviewer program. Links in the description below. But in any case, starting off with sRGB, which is how you should be consuming most SDR content. And here out of the box, you can see that it does have a few issues. It stretches colors because it's not in the proper mode, and it does have some other minor problems, such as with the white point. Now, thankfully, a lot of this can be resolved, and I will have the best settings for this display linked in my Patreon in the description below, which also gets you access to the Discord, where you can ask me questions directly, and we can pretend like we're family. But in any case, unfortunately, even after the adjustments, it still does have a couple of issues. As you can see here, it has just a little bit too much red, and it also has far too much of that red when you get near black, so really dark shades can actually be slightly off. And while the RGB balance is now good after adjustment, well, it is going to unfortunately be under tracking the EOTF curve at times, and it also is going to have raised shadow detail at the near black levels, which is not great to see. So there are a few problems that do make it a little bit worse than the PG32UCDM, which is the QD-OLED alternative. Hopefully this can be improved via firmware at some point in the future, but it's certainly not bad. Moving on to the HDR, and let's start off with HDR400 True Black. Once again, we do run into some similar issues. It's too red near black, and it also has some under tracking on the EOTF, and this time crushed shadow detail, which is actually pretty common for WOLEDs, and you do see similar results in all the other modes, such as the console, the gaming, and even the cinema HDR. And it even has some blown out highlights, which you can see from time to time in real content, making it hard to make out details that are supposed to be very bright. As for the ColorChecker results, for sRGB, it actually was pretty good with an average ΔE of just 1.7, and for HDR, I got an average ΔE of 2.88, which for HDR is actually very good on a monitor. And as for the BT 2020 gamut coverage, well, I did get 71.45%, which is in line with other WOLED displays and is far behind what QD-OLED can achieve. So the TLDR, look, for a gaming monitor, I do think the results here are actually very good and better than a lot of others on the market. But when you compare it to the PG32UCDM, the QD-OLED alternative, well, especially for SDR content, that thing definitely had better accuracy overall. So it's a bit of a step down from its QD-OLED brother, which is unfortunate to see. And especially in the HDR modes, there are some issues that are definitely noticeable in real content and do detract from the HDR experience. But now let's move on to the good news, because everything else is uphill from here. And let's start off with the brightness. Now, brightness is super important for HDR content. Now, unfortunately, monitors are still far behind their TV counterparts, and if you want super bright HDR, well, I recommend watching this review right here on the LG G5. That thing is very similar to this, but it's larger and much brighter. In fact, it's the one behind me right now. But in any case, in terms of brightness, it's actually pretty impressive. I mean, if you take a look here at the peak window brightness at the D65 white point, we do have the ASUS Glossy True Black OLED coming in as one of the brightest OLEDs I have ever measured, with 753 nits in a 10% window and 272 in a 100% window. But once again, you compare that to the LG G5 OLED TV, the 55-inch, and that thing is just absolutely insane. Over 2,500 800 nits. Yes, we're talking about nearly 4 times the brightness of what this OLED monitor can achieve, and that just puts that into perspective. But what about in real content? I mean, does it change? And here, once again, we do have the ASUS True Black Glossy OLED doing very, very well, close to the top of the charts when it comes to monitors, far outstripping its QD-OLED alternatives. But once again, in this real HDR brightness test of Baldur's Gate 3, well, the LG G5 OLED TV absolutely slaughters it, coming in with over 2200 nits in a 10% window and over 700 nits in a 100% window, which means that the ASUS True Black Glossy OLED actually has a lower peak brightness on a highlight than what the G5 OLED TV can achieve just on the ground itself in this scene. However, when you compare this monitor to QD-OLED monitors, again, it's pretty far ahead, and I do think it's noticeable. Now, one other thing that's very noticeable when compared to QD-OLED is its ambient light handling, because my God, does it blow QD-OLED out of the water. Now, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. We'll talk about that in just a second, but take a look here at the ambient light results versus a QD-OLED. We're looking at a minimum brightness of what's supposed to be a black screen, which ideally should be 0, of just 0.05 on this brand new ASUS XG32. And when you compare that to the latest 32-inch QD-OLED monitors, well, that gets 0.18. Now, that's pretty significant because that means that QD-OLED is going to have almost 4 times worse black levels versus this new glossy True Black coming from ASUS. And you might be asking the question, is this noticeable? And I would tell you yes. Not only is it very, very noticeable in some of the footage I'll be showing you now when you have studio lights in your room, but I can tell you right now that even in a room like this that I'm in with a window right next to me, if I was just to crack that window a little bit and just a little tiny bit of ambient light comes into this room, you will notice a significant difference between the True Black Glossy WOLED and the QD-OLED. The QD-OLED will have a bit of a haze over it. The shadow detail will start to be wiped away, and it'll generally look a lot lower contrast than a glossy WOLED. On the one hand, QD-OLED will definitely have better colors in a dark room, but on the other hand, WOLED will perform much, much better even in a room that has just a little tiny bit of ambient light, let alone a room that has a lot of it. And I do think the difference is very, very significant. Now, one other thing I do want to give to QD-OLED is that the near black on QD-OLED tends to look a little bit better, a little bit cleaner. It seems like because of the white subpixel, there's a little bit of issues with dark gray content looking just a little bit grainy or not quite as clean as it looks on a QD-OLED. So do keep that in mind. That is also noticeable. So if you're in a dark room, again, I wouldn't just totally throw QD-OLED out just because it's not as bright. I do think that it is going to be a good option for a lot of people out there who are in a totally light controlled room. If that's you, well, I'll have affiliate links to the ASUS PG32UCDM in the description below, as well as a full review on that one if that's something that you're more looking for. But if you're watching this video, you're probably looking for gaming performance. And don't worry, I got you covered. We can see that in terms of latency, the ASUS XG32UCWMG at the 480Hz mode at least is the absolute fastest display I have ever measured. Now, before you start throwing things out your window, do keep in mind there's a margin of error of 1 millisecond here, but regardless, it goes to show that this is probably one of, if not the fastest displays you can possibly buy today when it comes to input latency, if you run it at the 480Hz mode. But what about the motion performance? Because this is possibly even more important than the latency. And here you can see that both in the 480Hz mode as well as the 240Hz plus BFI mode, which by the way, you can use black frame insertion at both the 4K and 1080p resolution. So you could either run 120Hz at 4K and get 240Hz motion, or 240Hz at the 1080p resolution and get 480Hz motion if you're okay with cutting the total brightness in half, which is a pretty big sacrifice, but in a dark room could be worth it. And yeah, in both these modes, my God, this is insanely clear in motion. In fact, this may be the clearest I've ever seen in motion out of anything on the market today. I mean, compared to the 500Hz QD-OLED, you really can't see much of a difference. In fact, you can't even see much of a difference between this at the 480Hz mode versus the example image. So yes, this is possibly one of the best gaming displays you can buy on the market today, explicitly for competitive gaming. And if that's what you're after, hey, look, I'll have affiliate links in the description below, but you probably want to learn more. So let's move on to the next category, and that is the features, because not only do you get black frame insertion, but it also comes with a motion sensor and some other features in the display as well. But the motion sensor is interesting because it could help prevent burn-in pretty significantly. You walk away, it turns off, you come back, it automatically turns on. That's pretty awesome. Also, in terms of the text clarity and sub-pixel layout, honestly, this is great for an OLED display. It comes with the new RGWB sub-pixel arrangement, and I will tell you, especially on white backgrounds, I don't see too much shadowing or fringing on the edges of text, especially at a 32-inch size. It honestly looks really great overall. Is it perfect? No, but I do think that most people are gonna be very satisfied with it, and the overall perceived clarity of this thing is absolutely insane because it comes with the glossy coating, which is a huge step up over the matte coating of previous options on the market. I mean, if you told me, hey, I'm considering choosing between the ASUS matte version or the ASUS glossy version, I would be like, take that matte version, throw it on the ground, and hit it with a hammer. It is so massively inferior in terms of clarity and just perceived depth versus this new glossy version that it is a joke to even compare them. Now, I will tell you it's not 100% perfect. It's about 99.9% grain-free. If you put your eyes directly up to the monitor and you really look, it's got a little tiny bit when you move white windows back and forth, but this is nothing like their previous attempt at glossy, which did have some very noticeable grain under the glossy coating. In fact, it was such noticeable grain that I deemed it more of a semi-gloss than a glossy. This time, I'm telling you, at a normal distance, you will not see that. It's gonna look extremely clear. In fact, especially in a bright room, it looks even more clear than the glossy that you get on the QD-OLED. And also in terms of the viewing angles and uniformity, personally, my unit was pretty good. I didn't see any massive banding or any issues like that. And it also did have pretty good viewing angles, although there is a bit of green tinting off angle, like with every WOLED. Also, I had pretty much no issues after a firmware update, other than if you use the higher brightness HDR modes, it can kind of shift in brightness a little bit here and there because they're kind of fighting with the panel power, it seems, to get you as much brightness as possible, but it wasn't a major issue. And the menu and firmware is excellent. And the only other issue that you will run into with pretty much all OLEDs is if you're getting a low inconsistent frame rate with dark HDR content, you may run into some flickering. So what do I think about the new True Black glossy ASUS WOLED display? Does it deliver on everything that was promised? Pretty much yes. This is a huge, monumental step up in quality over the older matte options. It is such a massive improvement that cannot be understated, and they finally have on their hands a true competitor to QD-OLED that in many areas is actually better. I mean, not only are you getting a 480 Hz mode, so it could be better for some online competitive gamers, but you also get black frame insertion, making it even more attainable. You also get higher brightness, and you can actually display a decent amount of HDR 1000 content if it's graded more conservatively. There is some content out there that we'll still struggle with, especially since it blows out highlights, but overall it does a much better job not dimming down like QD-OLEDs do. It also performs much better in brighter environments, and even when a small amount of ambient light is present, it absolutely wipes the floor with the perceived contrast versus a QD-OLED. So if you're someone who wants to have a window crack, or maybe just a little bit of light coming through an open door in your room, well, this is probably gonna be a better option for you than QD-OLED, but it's not perfect. It had more issues when it came to accuracy versus QD-OLED. Some dark gray content can have a bit of grain on it, and I did see some crushed shadow detail in the HDR modes, as well as the higher brightness HDR modes were blowing out highlights. Also, QD-OLED is gonna have better color. So for those reasons, if you're in a totally pitch black room, QD-OLED still might be a better option for you. But I'm gonna be honest, I do think overall for most gamers, this will be now the best OLED that you can get on the market today. I do have my gripes with it, especially that I think it's not quite bright enough still, but as a whole, if you ask me what would I buy, what 32-inch OLED would I buy today on the market, I'd probably tell you the ASUS XG32UC whatever. True Black Glossy WOLED. And for that reason, despite its flaws, I'm gonna give it a solid 9 out of 10. I highly recommend it, and I'll have affiliate links to this thing when it's available in the description below, which, by the way, it sounds like it will be available in September. So get ready to get your wallets out and throw them at this brand new, very excellent monitor. For everything else display related, make sure to get subscribed here on The Display Guy.